All right, everybody, here we are at the last session for our day one from Mumbai chapter about a very interesting topic, DevSecOps, the what and the why. And we have Ritesh Shergill, who is Vice President at JP Morgan Chase, sharing his thoughts and ideas with us on this topic. And before we begin with the session, let me once again thank our founding sponsor, Innovation Roots, which is a leading consulting and training service provider and helping organizations to achieve business agility and beyond. You can find out more details at www.innovationroots.com. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Gile, which is a product offering from Tata Consultancy Services Limited. It is a purely cloud-based enterprise agile planning tool along with DevOps capabilities. Enterprises can use Gile to adopt agile practices or scale across multiple Scrum and Kanban teams using enterprise scaling frameworks such as, say, Disciplined Agile, Less, and more. You can find out more details at our Agile Network India page and connect with us to set up an exclusive product demo. I would also request everybody to use high quality speakers or headphones for better sound quality. At all times, keep your microphones muted and videos disabled unless you're a speaker or a presenter. Otherwise, it causes disturbance and bandwidth issues to the speaker. At any point you have questions, please make use of the chat. And at the end of the session, the facilitator will take up the questions from the chat and we'll answer them as per the time available in the hand. Also, at the end of the session, please fill in the feedback form, which will be shared in the chat to help us improve in the future events. We appreciate your cooperation in following these steps. And with that, I'll not take much of your time. I would like to call upon Amog, who is going to facilitate our next session, along with Ritesh, who is going to share his valuable insights with us. So over to both of you.
Thank you very much, Nupur. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining on this Saturday evening for this wonderful session of DevSecOps, the what and the why parties. On the behalf of Agile Network India Mumbai chapter, I would like to welcome you all for this wonderful session, which will be presenting by the Ritesh, who is working as a vice president in the JP Morgan. So I'm Amok Suktankar. I'm working as Agile Network India for Mumbai chapter as a volunteer, and I do have more than 20 plus years of work experience in the IT. From the working agreement perspective, this session is around for 50 minutes. So what are the questions, what all the participants can post in the chat window? I will take all those questions in the last 10 minutes. And any questions you do have, please put only in chat and as per the request, as per the working agreement. So overall expectation from this session is, at least for me, I know what is the purpose of this DevSecOps, why it is so important, and basically what are the best practices and what are the end benefits which you can get from this session. So that is from my side. So over to you, Ritesh.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Amok. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and a big thank you for the Agile Network India to have me over to give this presentation on DevSecOps. A quick disclaimer before I begin: any opinions that I state during the course of this presentation are my own. They are solely my representation, nothing to do with my employment at JP Morgan Chase or a representation of the function that I serve at JP Morgan Chase. So that said, I'm gonna dive into the presentation straight away. So when we think about DevSecOps, of course, all of you are already working in the industry for quite a while now. You're already aware of what DevOps is all about. But another dimension that we want to add to DevOps is security. And of course, in today's day and age, we all know how important securing everything is. Your personal information, your mobiles, anything you do on your laptop, anything you watch, all of that needs to be secure, because there's always someone or the other out there on the internet finding a way to pull a fast one on you. So DevSecOps, when it comes to building applications in our day-to-day work, it has to be a culture and it has to be a way of thought, a way of thinking when we are actually developing our applications. So I am today here to talk about the what, the why, the how, and so on. So without further ado, let's dive into the remaining presentation. So before we get to the next part, I just want to spend a minute or so and have everyone think about some of the hacks, some of the hacking scandals that have taken place in recent times. If you could just use the chat window and just put your impressions or your thoughts about some of the hacking scandals that have taken place, just spend a minute or so using the chat window, and then we'll talk about some of the most massive hacking scandals that have taken place in the past couple of years or so. I'm just going to pause for a few seconds and allow people to use the chat function to put those. What do you think was the biggest hacking scandal in your opinion in the past few years? Okay, so I'm going to reveal here some of the biggest hacking scandals in recent times, and these actually had a personal touch to it as well. Was one that Ashley Madison had. Everybody is aware of Ashley Madison. It was actually a website that allowed people to commit adultery, to come on the website, married people trying to date other married people, and it was all supposed to be very secure, very private, and very confidential. And one fine day, a hacker managed to gain access to the server using a zero-day exploit, and he was able to expose the details, personal details of many of these users, leading to a massive scandal for the organization, and a lot of negative press for Ashley Madison itself. And although to Ashley Madison the cost and legal fees were around $30 million, and it's still counting today, the users that were on the platform, the legal ramification for them, the destroying of their personal lives, it was a massive impact that is being felt even to this day. The Sony hacking scandal. Now we all know how secretive Sony is about some of its some of the movies it's going to be doing, some of its employee details, some of the studio work that they do. A hacker managed to exploit the Sony website and gain access to the Sony network and actually steal some of the private information of the employees. Some of the actual movie reels that they had shot, confidential information of certain employees was stolen. And although to Sony, the impact was around $8 million in remuneration and counting in legal fees, impact otherwise has been all the revenue that they've lost in the movies they could have released in theaters, and the loss of face in the public opinion. And then, of course, in the recent time, the LinkedIn hack, where web crawlers scraped data from the website and exposed personal data of millions of users across the world. Unfortunately, I was also one of those people who lost his email and phone number. But then, so these, of course, impact us personally as well. So it's very important to consider these factors. And in terms of government websites, of course, somebody talked about the Pentagon, but closer home, if you look at Indian ministries, Indian departments, a total of 154 and 59 Indian websites, Indian government websites were hacked in the past 3 years. And the cost has been to the tune of around 3.7 lakh crore due to cyber crimes in India since the year 2019. So if you look at these numbers, these are massive numbers, and they paint a very bleak picture for us. It says that anything that you're creating and you're going to put it on the internet for you people to use, it has to be secure. So hackers only need to succeed once, but when we are defending our website, we have to defend the website successfully every single time. The moment a hacker finds a vulnerability, we are done for. I'm going to talk about the problem. What's the problem exactly? So usually when we are creating our softwares, we believe that we should work in silos. So the development team works in one silo, it develops the application. The quality assurance team tests the application, lets the development team know that these are the bugs that are found. And then there are red teams that do the security testing of the application. They are working in another silo. And more often than not, when software gets delivered on the internet and then we find an issue, the blame game starts. And it is very counterproductive for people to do the blame game, because the time you spend blaming each other is the time you spend not patching the problem, not testing the software for further vulnerabilities that you might have introduced, not looking into the specifics of how the problem has occurred, the causality of it. And because of this blame game, it becomes very counterproductive, and there's a lot of negativity that comes into the picture, which is totally avoidable. The next thing is that because we are always rushing to deliver software, there's always something that we need to deliver in the next couple of weeks, because somebody needs it, the client needs it, the management thinks that we need to deliver this because of stringent deadlines and so on. Because we are always rushing to deliver and there is a human aspect involved, we are bound to make mistakes. And because we are rushing and we are doing things manually, we are bound to make those mistakes and push that faulty software to production. A very good example of this particular instance, where a particular software that got delivered onto the internet, it's a REST endpoint, and in the endpoint we are basically getting customer details for somebody. But at the same point of time, if you see, a hacker can exploit this and just pass a string of all 1 equal to 1, and because this exact same parameter gets passed to the JDBC, that JDBC string that we are using to query the database, the hacker is able to get all of the customer details within the website. So this is basically a classic example of an SQL injection attack, and this is something that we do on a regular basis. We just feel that let's create a REST point very quickly, let's pass the variable as a parameter. That's a big no-no. And these are the shortcuts. This is another reason why we fail to secure our web applications. So what are the consequences of all of this? Loss of client confidence, loss of business, potential lawsuits, negative press, mounting losses, and in total a catastrophe of spectacular proportions. Of course, all of this is avoidable, and we'll talk about how we can solve the problem. So the next is, what can we do to solve the problem at hand? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually take a step back from our development efforts when we are developing our applications and actually think about threat modeling. Now, threat modeling is nothing but you are basically trying to identify threats early, very early on in the development cycle. Identify attack surfaces which are nothing but information that you are exposing to the internet, or APIs that you are exposing to the internet for people to actually send data to your application or receive data from your application. Address these issues very early in the development cycle, even before it goes to production. Test on a regular basis, release a quality secure product, and once all that is done, only then you should go and have a pizza party, which is very normal for us because that's what we do on a regular basis. We usually organize a pizza party when we release something into production. But I would say hold on to the pizza until you're very sure that you release a secure product into production. So how do we go about doing the threat modeling? A very good pointer is the attack surface checklist. And this is as comprehensive as it gets. So the two items that you should be looking at are the OWASP top 10. And OWASP top 10 is nothing but a compilation of the latest and greatest in the security vulnerabilities that have been introduced in web applications in recent times that hackers can potentially exploit. It is updated on a regular basis. There's a lot of community contribution to this. So it's always a good thing to actually go and check out this website on OWASP and check what vulnerabilities you might have introduced into your web application. The second is the MITRE attack matrix. I call it MITRE, very similar to Mitro. So you can use the attack matrix again, and it is fairly comprehensive because it has been compiled by stalwarts across the private sector organizations, government agencies, cybersecurity firms, and community contributions across the world. Sorry, someone saying something? My voice is echoing. Okay. So this is also worth checking out. It's worth going to this website, checking out the matrix, and seeing what vulnerabilities could be introduced within your application during the development lifecycle. Now you must be thinking that there is so much manual work involved. It does not have to be manual, and let me talk about that. So how are we going to make sure that we, in an automated fashion, secure our web applications? So if you look at the traditional model of delivery, you had your CI/CD pipelines. They were building software, compiling it, compiling a version of it, taking the code from somewhere, dumping it on a cloud somewhere, exposing certain REST endpoints, and so on. So in a traditional pattern, you usually had the CI/CD pipeline. You had maybe a static analysis tool running on the code, telling you about how well have you unit tested the code, some other metrics like if you've introduced any other cyclomatic complexities and so on. And then this gets released to production. And then security is a peripheral item that we only think about when we release something into production. And then generally the Indian mindset is dekhi jayegi. We'll release it to production, uska dekhi jayegi. But when you're talking about security, like I said, a hacker only needs to succeed once, so it cannot be dekhi jayegi. I'm going to talk about a massive left shift. So instead of leaving everything to the end of the software lifecycle, we're actually going to integrate our DevSecOps, and this is where DevSecOps becomes important. We're going to actually automate the threat modeling that we've done into our pipeline, so that every time we are releasing a piece of software, we're actually doing a static analysis of the tool. We are doing a dynamic analysis of the tool, making sure that we have patched all the vulnerabilities, preferably in a lower environment like user acceptance testing or quality assurance, whatever you might call it in your organization. And then once we are very sure that we've not introduced vulnerabilities within the software itself, leaving aside the infrastructure, That's when we said, yes, our software is secure. Let's go ahead and release it production because we haven't introduced any vulnerabilities. Okay, so we have reduced the number of attack services or potential attack vectors for hackers. Some of the tools that help with doing the threat modeling is there are SCST tools, which are nothing but static app security testing tools. Then there are IST tools, which are interactive app security testing tools. DST tools, which are nothing but dynamic app security testing tools. I'll just talk a little bit about these tools. So SAST are nothing but static analysis tools that are running on your pipeline on a regular basis, looking at the code that you've written, and they are not platform agnostic or your code agnostic. They have to be aware of the language of the code that you've written. And so some of the tools that you can use for SST is GitLab in recent times has introduced its own SST software. If you are hosting, if you are using GitHub as a repo, Fortify is another very popular SST tool that is used to scan Java applications. Bandit is a popular SST tool that is used to scan code that is written in Python. And ESN Secure is used to secure code that you've written in Node.js or JavaScript. Then you have IST tools, which are nothing but interactive security analysis tools, and they do have a fundamental understanding of the application. SAST and IST are forms of white box testing. They are not platform agnostic. So two very popular tools are Accutenix and Snyk. Both have paid and free versions. You can go and check out the website, and they have very good manuals on how you can implement them within your organization. Of course, it's worth paying for the enterprise license and getting these softwares to run on a regular basis on the softwares to make sure you're securing them. The final one is DST, which is nothing but dynamic app security testing, which is agnostic of the underlying platform. And you basically point it to a URL and you say, run amok and test my platform for vulnerabilities. One of the open source tools that is used very regularly is ZAttack Proxy. And apart from that, a paid tool is Burp Suite. Of course, you can go and check out these tools and how you can implement them within your organization. So it's going to help you with your threat modeling, but there's only this is only one aspect of it. I'm going to touch upon other aspects as well. This is an analysis of a DST tool that I just run on a basic web application that I created, running it on localhost, not exposing it to the internet because I've intentionally left some loopholes in there. So if you see over here, some of the findings of the DST tool, and this is basically ZAttack Proxy that I've used, it's saying that there's a CSP wildcard directive, and that is nothing but the content security policy that talks about what sort of URLs are you allowing. Are you whitelisting any URLs to allow and access a website? Are you exposing anything to the outer world that you should not be exposing? Then cross-domain misconfiguration. So everybody is aware of CORS, and the moment we have a CORS misconfiguration, that is a big no-no. We have to be very careful about how we set our CORS headers. Xframe options. So again, if Xframes are not set properly, then there is a potential. If your website is using iframes, then people can actually use that to hijack your website, carry out DDoS attacks, and so on. And then server leaks information by X-powered by. X-powered by actually tells people downstream where your website is hosted, what is the URL, what is the host name, and so on. So it's worth securing that information. So all of this information I have unsecured, and the DST tool is clearly telling me that you haven't taken these steps and you're potentially opening yourself up to a hack. The next thing I want to talk about is red teaming and DNS tools. And red teaming is a very, very, very important aspect of an enterprise. So basically, what are red teams? They are just ethical hackers who are trying to hack the software that we are building, and they are trying to deconstruct the software we are building and trying to find vulnerabilities very earlier on in the application lifecycle. A very good recommendation is to have the red teams actually testing software on the UAT environment. And of course, when we talk about user acceptance testing environment, they should be nothing but an exact replica of the production environment. They should have similar data, they should have a similar infrastructure setup, and so on. And that's where you prove. It's a proving ground that your software is ready for production. So it's very good to have feature. So red teams, along with breach and attack simulation tools, again, breach and attack simulation tools carry out a very intrusive software testing of your application. They are a form of white box testing. They are not platform agnostic. They are very well aware of the platform that you use to deploy the code and write the code. They are also supposed to run on a regular basis and give you insights onto what sort of vulnerabilities you've introduced into the application. Some of the popular BAS tools are Attack IQ, Simulate, and FireEye. Again, Attack IQ is open source. You do have an open source version and you have an enterprise version, and it is updated on a regular basis. Simulate and FireEye are paid versions. But again, if you're a larger organization, if you're regularly putting software on the internet, you have massive visibility. It's always a great idea to buy a paid software that's patched regularly, that has support from the creators of the software, and these are all SaaS tools, software as a service that you can deploy on premises and have them run on a regular basis. CART is another dimension, that is continuous automated red teaming. It is over and above breach and attack simulation tools. So these are actually red teams that are continuously writing automated software. Of course, we have tools that do this, but red teams themselves, they actually write enterprise automation suites to test software that is delivered on the organization's platform on a regular basis. And they are capable of launching multi-stage attacks. They are capable of uncovering attack surfaces, any attack surfaces that you've exposed within your website. And they use an outside approach that does not require hardware or software to be installed on premises. Okay. So some of the cons, these aren't really cons, so to speak, because of course, implementing these, you're making sure that the websites are secure. But of course, it does involve a lot of manual time and effort and a lot of planning to simulate any of these tests on the lower environments that you have. They are potentially expensive because they aren't open source tools. They have to be updated on a regular basis. You need support as well from the software creators. Some of them require on-premises installation of software and technical know-how to maintain. So you are going to be carving out some aspect of your enterprise architecture or some area within where you're deploying your web applications to allow these third-party softwares to be installed and run on a regular basis. And they are predominantly provided by third-party vendors. They are updated predominantly by the third-party vendors, unless you have a red team creating your own enterprise software to do breach and attack simulation. And they should not, although they can be, but they should not be run against live production servers, because there is a visible attack, visible drop in performance when they are running these live on the tools that you have deployed. So in an ideal environment, this is what an ideal environment should look like. You have your smaller teams that have your CI/CD pipelines, and you have your SAST tools running on a regular basis. Then you have DAST, BAS, CART tools running on a regular basis on the user acceptance testing servers. And the servers themselves are nothing but mimicking the exact production environment. So if in production you're using HTTPS, the same protocol needs to be used in the UAT environment as well. So at this point, you could say that after having run all of these tools, you are pretty sure that you have taken care of your threat modeling and you can rest easy. But it's no easy feat. Of course, there's a lot of time and energy that's involved in doing these things, and a lot of manual effort that is involved in doing these things. But at the end of the day, you have to secure our web applications, and this has to be done on a regular basis. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is microservices and how important they are to create an enterprise architecture that will allow you to implement DevSecOps. So in my opinion, and this is what I've seen from my years of experience working with larger setups, monolithic applications versus microservices, in my opinion, having a proper agile mindset along with DevOps, along with security integrated and baked into the DevOps model, with a microservices architecture distributed across smaller teams, is a formula for success. And why is that a formula for success? It's simply because when you're dealing with microservices, you're deploying to containers more often than not. And because containers are self-contained environments, it's very easy to simulate certain conditions inside a container. It's dirt cheap to do so. You can have multiple instances of the container running at any time. You can run attack simulations at any point of time against containers, against Kubernetes clusters, and you make sure that you're trying to destroy your environment, that you are actually running in prod in a manner that will give you insights even before you go to prod. And here canary deployments or blue-green deployments become very important even before you release a version of a software to production. Before you switch it over, you actually do all of the testing. You thoroughly test that instance, the environment, to make sure that your tools are tested, the software is tested, and then you can rest easy and you can just switch over the environment. Like for example, you have V1 running in production, you have V2, that is basically the blue. Then you make the blue the green, you switch over the green to the blue, and then you archive it or whatever you want to do with it. And then you make sure that you release a secure software with the environment that actually mimics production. Recommended is to run SAST against your CI/CD pipelines, DST against the containers, and breach and attack simulation tools or CART tools against your Kubernetes clusters. If you have a service mesh, you can do that. Also recommended is to have multiple environments created. So development team has a separate environment where they might run SAST tools. Then you might have DST running against UAT. You have UAT version 2, which had breach and attack. QA works on another version. The reason we are creating so many environments of the software is because we don't want to disrupt the functioning of any team. They are basically working or proving that their area is working correctly and it is functioning correctly. And those checklists are propagated back to the dev team to slot into their sprint life cycles as tech debt to be patched before the software is released into production. So this is where the CI/CD comes into place, that you are continuously upgrading the software, patching the vulnerabilities, and then releasing it instead of being in a rush to deliver it. And this is where transparency becomes very important. It is very important for all of the stakeholders that are working with the application to understand that security cannot be a peripheral item. It has to be patched before software goes into production, and it has to be done conscientiously and very regularly. Another benefit of microservices is because you're dealing with smaller applications, the concerns become smaller, the separation of concerns becomes easier, the aspects becomes easier to manage, and because of that you have smaller attack surfaces for obvious reasons. So because you have smaller concerns, the development team is very focused on developing these smaller components that you are pretty sure are going to be tested regularly, thoroughly, and then released. Focuses on continuous testing, continuous patching, and patching smaller applications is much easier than patching a massive application, simply because in massive applications you have so many dependencies that the moment I have to even upgrade a database, my god, it's going to take me at least a month to maybe change the kind of database and point into one, or upgrading a database. But with a smaller application, these activities become very small and very easy to maintain and do. Fewer tests to be executed as the code base is smaller. Of course, the tests that are going to be run, if you're going to run it against a monolith, they're going to take at least a couple of days to run. But the moment the code base is smaller, of course, it might take maybe an hour or so to run all of the gamut of tests, including the secure tests. Re-engineering and re-architecting in case you have uncovered a vulnerability that requires an entire design change or a design rethink. With a smaller application, it becomes so much more easier to repurpose the application rather than a monolith where there are so many dependencies, where you have downstream applications dependent on you, upstream applications dependent on you, right? And better management of priorities, because you are 100% clear on what you need to do in a particular sprint lifecycle, what are the vulnerabilities that you need to patch. Then the team has a concerted effort towards patching those before the software is released. And again, transparency becomes very important, because the moment a feature is getting pushed back to the next sprint, you have to be clear as to why we're pushing it back. It's simply because we have to patch this vulnerability and then release the software before doing it in retrospect and suffering the brunt of a hacker penetrating us. Some of the best practices that we can follow are multi-factor authentication and access controls. This is very important, and more often than not we skip this. So sending OTPs to mobile devices or sending OTPs to emails is a good practice when somebody is trying to log into the application, and maybe having lockouts, like if a person has entered a password incorrectly 5 times, then you lock them out. CAPTCHA is another popular tool, although I'm not a big fan of CAPTCHA. I hate entering CAPTCHA, but yes, it is a great tool to protect against bots that could potentially come onto your website and try to exploit it. Session and cookie hygiene, this also becomes very important, and I cannot stress enough on how important it is. Like, for example, one mistake that people make is if they are using JSON Web Tokens, JWTs, basically they are storing those inside local storage. That's a big no-no, because you're setting yourself for a man-in-the-middle attack. It is always recommended to have the tokens stored with the cookie, so that there's a conversation that happens between the client and the server. So the session and cookie hygiene becomes very important. How long is the session going to be? When will you invalidate it? What will you do when you invalidate it? What will your cookies look like? How long? When will they expire? And so on. Then I did talk about the MITR attack matrix, but there's no reason why red teams within an organization can't construct their own attack matrix as they go along. So it becomes a comprehensive database of queries or findings that you have, and then teams that are building applications within your enterprise architecture can actually refer to that attack matrix and see where we're at currently, what we have faced in the past, how did we clear those hurdles, what was the cause, how did we fix it, and so on. Encryption at rest, this is nothing but securing any of the static data or any of the data that's storing in databases or storage encryption. Encryption in transit, this is nothing but talking about the protocols like HTTPS, SSL, TLS, SFTP, FTPS, and doing IP whitelisting. And IP whitelist is nothing but if you trust certain sources of information, then you whitelist your IP addresses to make sure that only those machines are able to access. And this is good for within your organization. If you have applications talking to each other, then you can actually whitelist certain IP addresses, and elastic IP addresses help a lot in this regard. Password vault services, again, IP whitelisting, a combination of IP whitelisting and password access is used for password vault services. And instead of storing your password inside a database or inside your code base, you actually store them in a secure vault. And the vault itself, it provides access based on whitelisting and your credentials, your public or private key to give access to those passwords. So it's a good to have feature. And with this, you secure your any passwords that you're maintaining instead of maintaining inside the GitHub repo or inside the code itself or in a database, you actually put them on a password vault. It is worth thinking about authentication and authorization as a service. So basically, when we talk about authentication and authorization, usually you bake it into the application, but the rules across applications are very similar to how they authenticate users within a particular organization. So it makes sense to remove it out as a separate service, because then you're only maintaining that service, patching that for vulnerabilities, and testing it securely. So you do it in one place instead of within separate disparate applications. Actively monitoring traffic that you might gather from CDP tools like Segment or Google Analytics to make sure that there's no anomalous behavior. There are no bots coming into the platform, logging in for a 1-second session and crawling across your website and gathering information or scrapping information. So this has to be done on a regular basis. And of course, AIML helps in a great way to analyze those patterns and kind of give you a view as to what sort of anomalous behavior is taking place on the websites that you have made live onto production. And of course, introducing CDNs and robust edge servers. So Cloudflare is one great offering that does this. You might have heard about Cloudflare. It protects you against DDoS attacks. AWS has its own. GCP has its own edge server configuration, and then it also helps avoid the network latency problem for any of the static content that you have, like videos and images. So these are some of the best practices that you can follow. Apart from this, quickly I'll just touch upon some of the other practices. Now, within the smaller agile teams, and the reason you're having smaller teams is because you're maintaining that agility in delivering secure software, which is where which is where I say it's a culture, because the team that is developing, maintaining, and testing the software needs to understand this, and it's imperative that they understand this, that they own the application. It is their baby. When they are releasing it to production, it is their prerogative to release a secure piece of software. And within the teams, it is important to evangelize the importance of writing secure tested code. And it is great to probably nominate a couple of members within the team as probably to be the informal red team, kind of keep an eye on the code that is going into production, whether it is secure and all. And that responsibility can be rotated within the team on a regular basis, so that everybody has a fairly good idea about how secure code needs to be written. So with that, I come to the end of the session, and I'm going to open it up for any questions that anybody has. So I think that some people have already posted.
Yeah.
Do you want me to take this, or
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ritesh, for the informative session. So it was very very good session where you have completely covered overall landscape of the development, also how agile comes into the picture, also security piece, also overall how CI/CD pipeline along with the microservice, which is a good success slide which you have created, which is very informative for me at least. Thank you very much for covering the entire bigger landscape of how DevSecOps come into the picture. Thank you very much for the informative session. So I think we have one question from Prashant, wherein he has requested that what is the percentage of the effort and cost does the sec part normally takes from the overall program in service cost?
That's a good question. It depends whether you want to do security in-house and whether you want to have your own teams using open source software, in which case the only cost that you're incurring are the team members that are actually patching the vulnerabilities and scanning on a regular basis, which is why I said it's good to probably have a couple of members within each team functioning as a red team, and then having that responsibility rotating. And of course, when we go into the securing web application using some of the higher tier softwares, the enterprise softwares that we have, the costs escalate by a bit. But I'll tell you, these costs are costs that you're saving on your website not getting hacked, and is worth spending. So a software license would be $5,000 a year for a decent piece of software, and you also get the support. For example, Acute-NX is one that has an enterprise version that is going to cost you $5,000. You can go and check out the website for the latest costing. I'm talking from the costing that I saw a while back. So it's worth investing this money simply because you don't want to spend money and don't want to lose face by getting hacked, right? So if you talk about in terms of percentage, it can vary anywhere between, in terms of cost and effort, between 20 to 40% of effort, but it's worth it, trust me. And these efforts are not spent on development, but more towards when you're actually spending time getting the user acceptance testing done, because the SAST tools, those will highlight most of the vulnerabilities even while writing a piece of software, and they can be integrated into IDEs as well. So even as a developer is writing, the IDE will quickly analyze it and tell the developer, hey, this you're probably introducing a vulnerability here, you might need to patch this. So in terms of effort and cost, I'd say 20 to 40%, and those can escalate if you had an incident, because you're going to lose face and then the cost is going to escalate like anything. So it's best to avoid it and spend money upfront.
Yes, good thought. So there's another question from Ajay. What are the frequent challenges normally faced by the organization during such DevSecOps transformation stuff?
More than DevSecOps, actually, it's the thought process that people have, and that chalta hai attitude I talked about. A lot of people are not thinking about security at all when they're developing softwares.
Yes.
And they don't know what they did need to check for. Like, for example, I talked about the MITRE attack matrix. Organizations that are aware that this exists do a great job on securing their applications, but there are some organizations that are clueless. And when I talk about a comprehensive matrix of your own that you construct over a period of time, that's not a good to have. It's something that you must have within your organization, and making sure that teams follow those best practices. And if you don't do that, then you're just opening yourself up to that one hack, and then you're destroyed completely. I hope that answers the question.
I hope Ajay, this answered your question. So there's another question from Ajay. Do you think the in-house hackers should be part of the agile teams?
That's a very good question. So it makes sense to have teams in a concerted manner doing this. Yes, I say yes. You should have people who are deemed as ethical hackers or red teams working within the organization on a concerted effort, working across teams to test the software, and they have to do this on a regular basis, so they're going to have their hands full, of course. But there's no reason, and these are called purple teams, basically, where you kind of merge red teams and blue teams that are developing software into one team, and you have a couple of people functioning as the ethical hackers of the team, testing the software of that on a regular testing the software that the team is developing on a regular basis. So 80% of their job is actually testing the software, making sure that it's secure, and 20% is spent on patching it. So their entire effort is spent on making sure that this software is functional and it's not introduce any vulnerabilities. And again, if you rotate that role within the team, then you make sure that everybody has an idea that the day they start writing a piece of software, they write it in a secure manner. So there will come a point, maybe 2 to 3 months down the line, where the entire team is aware of how I need to write secure code, and they'll do it as a habit. They won't have to think twice about writing secure code. So there's a lot of cost savings there, instead of doing it afterwards when the tool finds vulnerabilities and the team goes back, oh my god, I found a vulnerability access in database, I might have to change this entire database access object, I'm going to have to change the way I access the database, all of that. You do that up front and you save cost there.
Yeah. So there is a question from Bhushan Patel. He wants to know more about the cyber laws, which are the more stringent as compared to the Indian or as compared to other countries.
Very interesting question. So India is trying to be very stringent, but the implementation is tough. So in a country like India, if you see, more often than not, you see the cops going here and there trying to figure out what the hell happened here. A lot of government websites get hacked and nobody's able to find the perpetrator, and this happens on a regular basis. Are they stringent? They try to be, Your personal information, no, it's not protected. So a lot of countries abroad, I don't know about if you know, are aware of the laws that maybe the country like UK has come out. They have actually come out with laws as to how organizations should be gathering data from the users, and going against those laws can cause severe penalties for the company that actually take that information. In India, there are no laws that are protecting that personal information of you or of yours, and on a regular basis through your phone, when you're putting anything on a website, any information, your email ID or maybe your phone number or anything that you're putting out there, anybody can exploit it. And the fact is that you might be getting solicited phone calls on a regular basis, and you might be wondering, how did this guy get my number? It's simple. It's because your number has been hacked and it's been put on the internet. I get a lot of unsolicited calls myself. Nothing I can do about it. I've just put Truecaller and make sure I don't answer those calls. So in India, no, they're not as stringent as they should be, simply because they don't have a fundamental understanding about what the laws should be and how they should be securing the information. We are very far away from implementing stringent laws, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I do have one question now. You're mentioning some about the tools such as SAST tool, DST tool. So would you like to throw some light on the SAST tool and DST tool? What are the main difference and which are the frequently used tool SAST and DST?
So one of the frequently used tools in SAST is GitLab. A lot of people are migrating to it simply because if you know that GitHub released their Copilot, and then it's become very popular. But apart from that, Fortify is one that is used for Java. I mentioned some of the popular tools already in the slides. Like Bandit is used for Python very regularly. ESLint Secure, it's a great software to run if you're developing an application in React and Node.js. These are the frameworks that I've worked with, the languages I've worked with. So I'm aware of these SAST tools, which is why I mentioned it on the slide. But apart from that, there are plenty of other SAST tools that you can implement. Some are paid, some are open source. But I would suggest, even if you're using an open source one, at least use an open source one, and instead of not using anything at all. So that would be my thing here. And DST tools, basically they are agnostic of the platform you've built, simply because they're trying to attack your website from outside. So they're going to be hitting your URL and trying to penetrate into the website, and it will try to find out what sort of vulnerabilities you will give. Some of the options that we saw, like for example, the X-frame options. Now, if I have iframes within my website and I'm not aware that I'm exposing that header in my HTTP calls, then I have a potential to get hacked. But the moment I run a DST tool like ZAttack Proxy, which is open source, or Burp Suite is pretty comprehensive. Acute-NX is also a very good software that you should check out. So these are some of the softwares that you should be looking at. Is it worth paying for the license for these softwares for your organization? Yes, definitely worth it. Take my word for it.
Thank you, Ritesh. There is another question from Ajay. Okay, so what are the different kind of guidelines we can use while implementing DevSecOps?
So I talked about threat modeling, right? The threat modeling needs to be habitual. It can't be an afterthought. Threat modeling needs to be done even as you're conceptualizing the architecture of your application, actually. And you need to make sure that you're identifying what sort of endpoints you're going to be exposing, what sort of sockets you're going to be exposing, what sort of how you, when you build your CI/CD pipeline, how are you obfuscating the code that you're writing. Would a hacker be able to exploit any of the vulnerabilities by just maybe using a decompiler to decompile the code and check out what you've written in the code? All of these things you need to think about when you're developing software. And of course, I've already talked about some of the tools. So SAST tools, I've already said, on the CI/CD pipelines, integrate them, have them run on a regular basis, maybe even in the IDE. On your lower environments like UAT and all, you have your IST, DST tools. And then once you have the environment ready, the breach and attack simulation tool should be running against your higher environments, making sure that they mimic the production environments and they are able to patch vulnerabilities. So that is a good structure to have. It is a recommended structure, and having the teams conscientiously following it and the stakeholders understanding that if I find a vulnerability within my software, I will be patching it immediately, not as an afterthought. I won't patch it tomorrow. I won't patch it day after. I won't patch it in the next sprint. I'm going to patch it today. It has to be done.
Yes, absolutely, makes sense. So there is another question from Ajay, which with respect to how do you measure the overall success criteria of this particular initiative of DevSecOps?
You if you don't get hacked successfully for a whole year, I think you've done pretty well. But success criteria, the best way to measure success criteria is to have all of the checks and balances in place, have a comprehensive attack matrix, and then maybe 6 months down the line, when you run your SAST, DST, IST tools and the BAS tools, you don't find a single vulnerability. So the percentage goes down of the issues that you find when you run these tools, and that's a great success measure. It means the teams have understood what needs to be done, how secure software needs to be built. So further down the line, 6 months down the line, the numbers are going to go down in terms of the vulnerabilities you find. So maybe you might find 50 to begin with, it goes down to 20, and the moment it goes down to 0, that's amazing. You've done very well then.
Thank you very much, Ritesh, for this such an informative session. And I think you answer all the questions very informatively. And thank you very much for sharing your own experiences on your day-to-day operation. And it was very much informative session. So thank you very much again.
So much.
So